Thank you for joining us for the IEEE Computer Society Standards webinar series, brought to you by the Standards Activities Board. With over 225 standards that transform the way we live, work, and communicate, the IEEE Computer Society sets the standard for design automation, simulation, testing technologies, Ethernet and Wi-Fi, quality assurance processes, systems architecture, DevOps, and more. Standards deliver best practice processes for developing market-ready interoperating systems, products, and services. You can have an impact by joining one of the over 200 IEEE Computer Society Standards working groups. Participating in one of the working groups grants you access to information that reduces risks, increases proficiency, and shapes the future of the industry. Help determine what's next in computing technology. Learn more about our standard working groups at computer.org/standards.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to today's webinars from our Standard Activity Board series and today's presentation from the IEEE Computer Society Landman Standard Committee. My name is Edward O. I'm the Vice President for Standard Activities of the IEEE Computer Society. Before we get started, I would like to address some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. You can ask any questions in the Q&A box you see on your screen. Both of our speakers will answer as many questions as possible after the end of their presentation. When submitting a question, please reference the slide if possible, and a copy of the slides and the recorded webinar will be emailed to you later this week. Circling back to today's presentation, when using a Wi-Fi enabled device, for example, your mobile phone, it can use GPS outdoors. But indoors, with a wood overhead, surrounding walls, or others, GPS signals are blocked. Furthermore, many applications simply require proximity detection with another device in order to provide a suitable user experience. While a mapping or proximity application can take you to a location with great precision outdoors, the technology for location or proximity indoor is not as accurate as possible. But this is rapidly changing as device manufacturers begin to innovate new use cases, leveraging the latest IEEE 802.11 standards, specifically the IEEE 802.11az and also the 802.11bk, which are the focus of today's webinars. And more importantly, I'm very happy to have the editor and also the chair of these two standards, Dr. Roy Won and Mr. Jonathan Sigiv, to share with us an overview of these two standards. Jonathan is currently a principal engineer at Intel Corporation and is a leading subject matter expert in wireless communications, including Wi-Fi, 3GPP, and ultra-wideband. He is leading and actively contributing to the development, interoperability, and market penetration of Wi-Fi location, Wi-Fi direct, and Wi-Fi array. As mentioned, he is the chair of both standards working groups, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science and Mathematics and a Practical Electrical Engineering degree. And Dr. Roy Won received his doctorate from Cambridge University, England, and is currently a Senior Research Scientist at Google. He holds the grade of the IEEE Fellow and ACM Fellow. His research interests include mobile and ubiquitous computing, content-aware applications, and electronic identification. Roy has more than 30 years' experience working in the field of mobile computing. In Computer Society, he also served as the editor-in-chief for IEEE Pervasive Computing from 2006 to 2009. And at ACM, he was the chair of the ACM SIG Mobile Executive Committee from 2009 to 2012 and received the ACM SIG Mobile Outstanding Awards Contributions Award in 2019. He has authored or co-authored more than 85 publications and more than 100 issued patents in these areas. And lastly, before we give the floor to the speaker, as a friendly reminder to all of us, please look that as per the IEEE Standard Association Standard Board Operation Manual at webinars here, any individual presenting information on IEEE standards shall make it clear that their views should be considered as their personal views rather than the formal position, explanation, or interpretation of the IEEE. Now, it's time for me to give the floor to Jonathan and later Roy to share with all of you the exciting Wi-Fi location and proximity technology. And Jonathan, thanks for coming. And you now have the floor to share with us what's the excitement about Wi-Fi technologies for positioning.
Okay, so thank you, Edward, and hello, everyone. We'll do, during this webinar, we'll do an overview. We'll start with an overview of what is Wi-Fi location, what is time of flight. We'll go through the very basic of the standard certification roadmap, the market landscape. We'll review the two schools of development of technology, which is dedicated versus an added service, and we'll see some real-world application. Then we'll dive in a bit into 802.11az in detail. And once we're done with that, we'll look at the enhancements that 11BK brought, and with that, we'll summarize. And so, one thing that's, worth mentioning is that, why is that, or what changed recently? And on your left and right are the two cover pages for 802.11az, which is a next generation positioning. That was the first dedicated project for positioning in Wi-Fi or in IEEE 802.11. That was published December of 2022. On your right, 802.11bk 2025, hot from the oven, was published in September of this year. So less than a month old. So with that publication, it's a good time to review the technology, and we're bringing you this webinar in accordance to that. So before we even start, and you'll see terminology like Wi-Fi location used here, and that's simply because the dominant technology that is IEEE 802.11 based is Wi-Fi. There are implementations that are not specifically Wi-Fi, but are based on 802.11. We use the terminology here interchangeably. But in general, Wi-Fi location, it uses range measurement that is derived from time of flight. And I'll explain what's that in just a minute. And that's a measurement, a time measurement between two stations, an I station or initiating station and a responding station. And to perform that, we need two measurements, essentially time of departure and time of arrival. And on your left here is a figure describing that the most basic element of any time of flight technology. There are two devices. One device transmits the first message, M1 in our case, and samples the transmit time of departure, TOD of M1. The other device receives that message and estimates a time of arrival of M1. All of that is done locally, so there's no time synchronization between them or clock synchronization. This technology will be able to do that, but there's no assumption of synchronization, of clock synchronization between the two. Then the other station transmits the second message, takes a sample T3 at time of departure of M2 and time of arrival of M2. And if we look at the interval T4 minus T1 between time of arrival of M2 and time of departure of M1 versus minus T3 minus T2, that difference in time is and divided by 2 is exactly the time of flight. Multiply that by the speed of light, c, and you'll get the range. From that range, you will multilaterate and you can infer a location. In between those, in between the time of arrival and time of departure, there is a small thing, which is the channel. The channel creates all kinds of phenomena, radio phenomena, the RF channel, multipath, deflection, reflection, attenuation, and so on that we need to deal with. And there's and we're going to review that in a bit more. So before we even, and so I mentioned that IEEE 802.11 fine timing measurement would be the procedure for that, or the protocol that we're using for that. But before we start at the very basic, we need to ask ourselves, okay, why did 802.11 decided to follow that path of time of flight versus other possible positioning technology? So let's do a short history of positioning in general. So on your left is the most basic technology that were the most basic technique for estimating range, which is RSSI, received signal strength. First off, is cheap because that measurement of RSSI is already available at the modem. It doesn't require a standard. In that respect, it's a huge advantage, right? You don't need to develop that standard. Standards tend to have a couple of years of development, needs to get agreement across the industry and so on. So it's a non-standard. It's assumed the main issue is that it assumes only a single phenomena, which is slow fading. So only path loss is considered. That is, in general, considered a substantial limitation. It's inaccurate due to that and due to non-line of sight conditions. Also, we can see on your bottom here an antenna pattern that creates a phenomena where the received signal strength can be drastically changing based not off your range to that other device, but just based on your location on that circle surrounding that, or on that sphere. So antenna pattern is a major issue, and that's also depending on the type of technology that's used, whether you assume a fixed mathematical model or you're doing a technique called fingerprinting. It requires an expensive site survey and so on. Off next is angular techniques, angle of arrival, angle of departure. Here the complexity immediately went up. There is a requirement to standardize because it needs to be interoperable, and you can't just use this. You can't just use devices and assume RSSI or a known metric. So that's one complexity. The other complexity is immediately you need to have at least one side that have multiple antennas, and your resolution of angular accuracy is dependent on that. So that's another one. An advantage of that technology is that it works in narrowband. For narrowband, so if you're RF, you're limited, you're adding that as an added service, and your basic service, say that you're using Bluetooth, you have a narrowband radio only, you can use this technique. And indeed, Bluetooth used that technique. However, once you get into the non-line of sight condition, it becomes meaningless. So if you're measuring reflection or a deflection of a signal, there you goes, your positioning becomes meaningless. And of course, the use of multiple antennas makes the product more expensive versus a product that can use a single antenna or a minimum amount of antennas, preferably the amount of antennas that you already have. So we come to time of flight. So we did evaluate that, and .11, when we started the project, and .11 itself does support the angular technique, but it also went and evaluate or adopted mostly the time of flight technique, which is it requires wide bandwidth. So the larger the bandwidth, the wider the bandwidth, the higher the resolution, channel resolution. It's mostly unaffected by changes in the signal strength. Obviously, at some point, you get to the point where your SNR isn't sufficient, but for the most of it, and we see that in real world and in the field, the technology can sustain substantial changes to the signal strength. It does require time of departure, time of arrival, specific hardware and algorithm for that estimation and detection, and the sophisticated first path detection. That's the time of arrival that we'll describe in a bit. So, and all in all, there's a trade-off. You can't have it all being both cheap, non-standard, and accurate. You need to have that trade-off. And .11 in general went towards the more accurate time of flight, less susceptible to those radio phenomena. Another question, or another major question that you need to ask is, should I go and develop a positioning system that is dedicated service, right? So that's the main service it provides, or do I add that to an existing service? On your left is an example of systems that are dedicated, such as the Global Positioning System. The US military was originally developed for the US military. That's the GPS system, uses a dedicated radio. UWB 802.11, 802.15 went through that path as well, offering ranging as a dedicated service. To the right, radios like the BLE, that or Bluetooth, that took kind of the middle path, and Wi-Fi, because they required maybe augmenting of the existing infrastructure. And to your right, Wi-Fi that went with the approach, .11 that went with the approach of adding that to your existing radio, using the radio that's already used for communication for other purposes. So let's explore the cons and pros, and so the pros and cons are shown from the dedicated perspective, and vice versa for the added service. So roadmap can be uncorrelated to your communication system. So if you have a pathway and say that .11, for example, have a cadence of generating a new file MAC every 4 to 5 years, you don't need to, if you're developing a system that is a dedicated system, you don't need to adhere to those kind of limitation. You can create VAS, you can create a short-term differentiation, you can bring the technology to the market faster, and the waveform can be specialized. You don't need to consider limitations of your existing modems and of your existing modem design, and you can do drastic changes, or the need to do drastic changes. Whereas if you're doing it as an added service, you need to work through that framework or through that ecosystem. The cons are quite a few. There is a cost of a dedicated radio when you add that into a product, so say your smartphone, your laptop, and so on. There's a form factor limitation. You need to have a dedicated antenna. Your silicon footprint increases, so that's on top of the additional cost. There's also regulatory issues or regulatory implications. Spectrum availability, when a government is, radio is a natural resource, and every government tries to take the most of that natural resource. And they're looking many times in terms of communication, they're looking at what's the commercial benefit, the economic benefit a country can make. So if you're bringing a single service, and you need to also allocate a specific spectrum for that, that's way harder. You always need to advocate for that and justify the need for that unique service. Whereas you coming as part of an existing ecosystem like .11 Wi-Fi, which is based on .11, did that, you can enjoy the spectrum availability, the link budget, transmitting power, for example, so that falls into link budget, and future allocations, spectrum allocation that comes as a result of that. And the impact of quality of service, it's a lot easier to coexist with a technology that is part of the same baseband versus a competing baseband. So if you transmitting on the .11 radio, you'll be immediately interfering with .15 radio, and vice versa. It's a lot easier to coordinate that. So that's another disadvantage of a dedicated radio versus, and being an advantage of an added service. So in general, just to summarize, Wi-Fi brings the growth, the proven track record, and the future roadmap with it. 802.11 shown for the last 25 years, growing from a very narrow band to the 300 megahertz channelization that is available today. the accuracy levels, and we'll see that in just a bit, that we're discussing with 802.11bk, which is the latest generation with 320 megahertz. We're talking about sub 1 meter, 0.1 meter accuracy. So, 10 centimeter accuracy, which is pretty amazing where the technology came from. We're talking about first generation RSSI based that was giving us between 10 and 15 meters, which is pretty hard for taking any advantage of that for human application. Whereas 0.1 meter accuracy takes you to a whole different place. Okay, let's do that landscape, or let's do the roadmap for .11 technology. As I mentioned, we started with RSSI and 11B. That was first generation. In the industry, it was called Wi-Fi 4. Second generation, Wi-Fi 5 or 802.11ac. That was many times you'll hear that throughout the discussion as RevMC FTM gave us 1 to 2 meter, a huge advantage over the 10 to 15 meter, right? It's a factor of 10. And then from that, we went into 11AZ, which essentially they took the 11AX and adapted that to positioning, and that was 11AZ FTM. That brought us the secure MAC and PHY. We'll talk a bit about that later on. It also brought the availability of MIMO and the ability to transmit 160 megahertz. So that was a great improvement. And the last generation is 802.11bk FTM that brought us, I'm showing here 0.2 meter, but it is better than that. We're already seeing that in the field. So that's rather conservative. And 320 megahertz bandwidth that is available, spectrum availability from the .11 ecosystem. And so if you would like to summarize the radio technique, and this slide gives you a rough summary of that, you can see that we started off with MC with 20, standardized wise, 20 to 160. In effect, we had products of up to 80 megahertz in the field. Today, we're seeing maybe a few that already are 160. AZ expanded that to 160 megahertz, also introduced the 6 gigahertz band. That was a major advantage of that. Introduced the ability to do MIMO, which is, again, a major factor in accuracy over a known venue, right? So, it increased the service availability and accuracy across the venue. Another major improvements were power improvements, scalability, and so on. And with .11bk, the introduction of the 320 megahertz channelization, it continued the same advantages or the same capabilities of .11az. And the main thing here is the channel puncturing. It's a functionality that allows 11bk and its inheritance of 11be, 802.11be, that allows lower level of interference or cross interference, especially in an overlapping BSS scenarios. So we can manage interference much better with that. And with that, I would like to move over to Roy, that will review use cases and applications.
Thank you, Jonathan. So use cases, we thought it was very important to actually talk about the value of this technology at this point in the presentation. So I want you to consider things like public spaces. At the moment, smartphones are not very good at navigating you through a public space like a retail store or a shopping mall. With this technology, we can position you precisely within an aisle and therefore give you turn-by-turn navigation in a similar way you'd have to, a GPS system in a car driving on the streets. It also allows for things like analytics in the stores, so that stores, perhaps if you're using a store app and you've agreed to the conditions of the app, will allow you analytics about where you've gone and what you've looked at, where you've dwelled, very important for planning in the store. Things like understanding the flows in public spaces, also very important. Another area is purely in the enterprise. Some enterprise campuses are very large and unwieldy. Indoor navigation to find the right conference room is obviously a big plus. Smart office services, perhaps things which control whether you can open a document in a certain area of the building or you have to be in a more secure area. Asset tracking in smart warehouses, so tracking where an object has been scanned onto a shelf, often very important because warehouses experience inventory overflow and things aren't always put in the place they should be. Sometimes they're put somewhere else because there isn't space. Another category is proximity applications, where two devices, when they come close, may want to share. So, for instance, photographs, or you may want to transfer a phone call, which you're currently receiving on one device, to another device, which has better setup, perhaps more like a VC setup. In the world of IoT, so Internet of Things, you often want to give fairly human-type commands to the environment. So, for instance, you would say something like "turn on the lamp." So the question for the IoT department is, which lamp are you talking about? And usually that would be the closest lamp. So location can give you good contextual clues as to what you're actually asking. And then a final big category is secure access. Often security, in addition to any of the encryption techniques which you're using to ensure the messages are authentic, can also be enabled by the contextual location of where you are. So, for instance, unlocking a laptop when you're close, but because you're carrying a watch or your phone is with you, and then when you walk away, the laptop automatically relocks. Venue access, similar concept. And of course, wireless keys for cars is another area that this kind of technology can be used for. When you're close and you've got the right encryption and authentication, then your car door will open. So I'd like to make this a little bit more real now by showing you a video. And this is indoor navigation in one of our campus buildings where I work. So we'll let this run now, and I will speak over it rather than giving you the audio that's present on the screen. So basically what we're doing here is we're finding a conference room on internal maps. And so you can see that it's found a route from where I am, which is in the top right-hand corner, down to where the conference room is. And you can see the gray dot is where the positioning system is thinking you are, and the blue dot or the blue line is where you're navigating to. Now you can see that we're deliberately making wrong turns, and obviously we've speeded this up tremendously to make it a more interesting video. But what you're seeing is it's automatically rerouting and snapping to the correct position on the routes which you can walk. So obviously there's some knowledge of the routing capability within that map and where the aisles are and where you can't walk. So the accuracy, certainly with 1 to 2 meters, allows you to position on the map, to snap to the right place, to figure out when you've gone off route, to reroute you, just as you would have in a car GPS, which obviously we're all very familiar with, but we're bringing that indoors with this technology. So another application which we thought is important to mention is this concept of positioning the anchors. And from Jonathan's quick overview of modularization, I think you also have to understand that not only are you trying to find, or not only do you need to know the phone's position in the end as a result of this technology from the ranges, but you also need to know the positions of the anchors. So in other words, the Wi-Fi access points. And you could obviously do this with a cloud service, but it's actually better for a number of reasons if it's a distributed solution and the access points themselves know where they are. And this whole area has actually been sort of encapsulated with or rather brought to the fore by the opening up of the 6 gigahertz band, where we are allowed to now use Wi-Fi access points operating in those channels. But because the legacy RF devices in those channels, there was a condition that you basically only operate at full power if you know you're inside a building. And so the way this works is that the APs themselves have a relationship where they can talk to other access points and figure out where they are relative to them. So in other words, the FTM capability has enabled access points to automatically figure out where they are, and therefore they can define exactly that they're inside the envelope of the building, and therefore use the power that you need to operate effectively within the Wi-Fi network within the building. So effectively what happens here is the access points use the Wi-Fi location protocol to ping each other and form a relative topology of where they are. If there was 10 or 20 access points on the screen at the moment, you would see more effectively that it was referring to this relative network. And then some of these access points will be on close to a window, close to the outside of the building, and that they will be able to get GPS information. And in fact, many of these modern anchors also have GPS in them. So now you have some anchoring of the relative topology within the building, and therefore you can then calculate from the anchors that do know their position all the other lat longs of the anchors which are within the building. And then so that in itself satisfies the requirements for 6 gigahertz. But then the best thing about this is that now the anchors can report their position, again using the FTM protocol, including that information in something called LCI, which is location configuration information. And so this makes it much easier for any venue to deploy this system with a location, because basically, finding out the lat longs of every access point in the building is a laborious task. And in many cases, it may not be done if it was just left to people. And this automates the whole process, making it possible. And then in this section, I just want to give you a little idea of the increase in accuracy that we can expect with AZ over MC. So on the left-hand side, you see a chart of accuracy for 11MC. The horizontal axis is the true range, and the estimated range over a number of readings, typically about 30 readings on these results. It gives you the spread of our ranges that we see. And for 11MC, we have a range accuracy of about 0.75 meters at the 90th percentile, if you plot this as a CDF. And for 11AZ, we see, again, a similar chart on the right-hand side. You can see the spread. If you plot that spread on a CDF chart, you can see this, the range accuracy is typically 0.4 meters at the 90th percentile. These are both at 80 megahertz, so the same bandwidth of channel. The key to the increased accuracy is the MIMO capabilities of 11AZ, which Jonathan and I will go into more detail on some of the next slides. So at this point, I'd like to hand back over to Jonathan to talk about the design of 11AZ.
Thank you, Roy. And so 11AZ was the first project in .11 that was a dedicated positioning project. So 11AZ, also known as next generation positioning. We already had at this point 802.11 2016 that included the basic FTM. We normally called it, in the standard you'll find it is EDCA based ranging or EDCA based FTM. But we wanted to do we wanted to have a better protocol. And one of the things that I remember that a bunch of people, we knew that we wanted to do something, but we weren't quite sure of where we want to improve. And so we wrote down or tried to map areas of improvement. We wanted much better scalability. We wanted improved power consumption, especially for long-term for mobile devices, smartphone and such. We wanted security, so it was 2016, but security was already on the rise, and we figured out we wanted not only to have max security, but we also want to have by security prevention against eavesdropping or some very sophisticated attacks. We weren't quite sure how we do that, but we wanted it, so we mapped it. We wanted an improved dynamic performance, ability to not set a fixed known measurement rate, but to modify it based on whether the person is moving or not moving, the channel conditions, and the errors that or interference that might be happening. And we wanted increased line of sight and line of sight. Now, in general, any communication protocol, you want to have a security and a negotiation done once, or at least the minimum amount of time. And then you want to do measurements as much as possible for the duration needed and to terminate once. So in general, to be efficient, you want to do minimum amount of overhead, and security and negotiation are overhead. Security negotiation and range measurement negotiation, procedure negotiation are overhead. Then you have the measurement and ended with the termination. So we wanted a lightweight protocol as far as security and negotiations are concerned, and focus on the measurements as much as needed. So we ended up with doing 11ax is the base technology that 802.11az. So we based our techniques on that, and we wanted to use the sounding mechanism, sounding in terms of channel estimation protocol, or to reuse that to the extent possible for 11az. So we ended up with two techniques, or two measurement procedures. One is called non-trigger based, which is an individual station addressing the access point or the R station and requesting a measurement. And the other one is trigger-based operation. Trigger-based operation is something that was introduced by 11ax. The trigger-based operation started from a polling mechanism, so it's kind of a multicast or a broadcast protocol. The access point, instead of the individual stations approaching at any given time the access point, it's now the access point that transmits a polling. So we have a polling phase, followed by a position sounding, right, phase. And at the end, and the multiple station will do that, conduct that during overlapping themselves using the trigger-based technique, and ended up with a reporting, which is again a multi-device transmission and reception. So we either have the AP transmit to multiple devices, or we have multiple devices transmitting back reports to the AP concurrently, and the AP is able to separate that without conflicting. That was trigger-based operation. What we have here is the most fundamental one, which is the non-trigger-based operation. On your left, the fundamental protocol of any time of flight measurement, M1 and M2, if you recall that from earlier on our webinar. And let's see how that maps into the actual .11 protocol. So we have an NDPA, non-NDP announcement frame. The NDPA mechanism is a mechanism, the standardized mechanism of 11ax and in .11 in general for sounding. So we use that, and instead of only have one null data packet, that is the sounding frame that you can see on the bottom, we have two copies of that. We have transmission from the I station to the R station, followed by an R station to I station transmission. And you can see the T1, T4, T2, and T3 mapping of time of arrival, time of departure from your left side into the real world protocol from .11. And at the end, you have a reporting. In our case, it's only the reporting from the R station to the R station of what is called an LMR, location measurement report. So first off, we can see a big departure from the RevMC protocol. If you read that, RevMC wasn't using the standardized sounding mechanism. It was kind of a fast and dirty development using the maintenance project. Once we had the project that was dedicated to .11, we can do all of that. At the bottom, you're seeing the waveform that's used for the sounding itself, and what you measure over is a set of HE.11ax LTF long training fields. And so a sequence of those long training fields are transmitted based on the number of antennas that you have, and that allows you to separate, do antenna separation, and receive each individual transmit path or and achieve spatial diversity. In that way, you can also do repetition, which also improves the SNR. That was that was non-trigger based. The main advantage in terms of how much time does it take, we brought what used to be multiple transmission of management frames. Each was at least 100 microsecond long, and you only get one symbol out of each. We ended up with a protocol that does everything in a single TX-OP of 500 microsecond or less. And that single TX-OP created the opportunity to do an interference or taking the medium from other station, which is a lot shorter. So that's a huge advantage there. The other option, as I mentioned, is the trigger-based. And as I mentioned, there is a polling part, a position sounding part, and a reporting part. The polling part is a trigger frame followed, allocating resources to stations that are subscribed for the service. Okay, so all those stations, station 1, 2, 3, up to N, have negotiated trigger-based operation with that AP. The AP allocates the trigger frame, allocates resource for them to indicate whether they need sounding or not. If a station decides that it doesn't even need to, it doesn't even respond to that poll, and that's why it says poll no response. So that's a no, it will not be allocated resources. Then follows the positioning sounding part, which is very similar. Again, there's a trigger frame, and multiple stations are allocated in the spatial domain. Each one is allocated a unique set of spatial streams, and so that would be your uplink and your downlink. We have a downlink NDP A and a downlink NDP, so that would be, again, multiple antennas, in this case from the AP side, but it's a single transmission, or it comes from a single source instead of coming from different sources from different stations like we have in the uplink. And at the end, we have reporting that is multi-transmission to multi-stations, right? So from the AP to the stations. Again, the unique thing about it is that the AP completes, or the entire sequence takes a single TX-OP. In our case, it's roughly less than 700 or 800 microseconds. So again, a very short interruption to the medium and to other station in terms of being an added service. So that's a huge advantage in terms of multiple stations transmit uplink NDP, and they're using multi-user MIMO, and the AP sends a downlink NDP, and it's a MIMO transmission as well. And the reporting part is a multi-user receive and transmit as well. So that's an advantage and a much better spectral efficiency overall, right? So with that, we wanted to explore accuracy, and for that, I'd like to take that over to Ron.
Thank you again, Jonathan. So one of the things about accuracy is that we need to consider what contributes to the accuracy. So there are basically four things which have an effect on the accuracy of the system. So the first is bandwidth. Second is signal to noise ratio. The third is spatial diversity, a number of paths between antennas. And the final one is the accuracy of the detection algorithm itself. So on the right-hand side, you can see that there is a representation of the Wi-Fi channel impulse response. So this is basically derived from the fact that each of the Wi-Fi packets it's an OFDM encoding. So there's a training field at the beginning of each packet, and each packet's training field contains all of the subcarriers. And so if you combine those subcarriers in the time domain, removing the Golay sequence, which smooths out into a nice PAPR, you end up with an impulse response. So mathematically, you can define the impulse response. And there ideally should be a first path, but of course there are reflections, and that causes a problem. Now the bandwidth affects the narrowness or the spread of each of those reflections, and so a higher bandwidth, it creates a steeper impulse representation in the time domain. So the higher bandwidth we have, the more accuracy we'd expect, because we can detect the beginning of that pulse more accurately. And what you have to remember is that the accuracy of the system, as the RF signals are traveling at the speed of light, if you're one nanosecond off, that means you have an error of 1 foot. And so it's not particularly hard to get a few nanoseconds in it as a result of any of these situations. So let's look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. So this, you can see the build here with other reflections appearing and the potential error that you could get. So advantage of LTF repetitions, first of all. So in our original 11MC FDM packet, there basically was a single LTF, so there's no repetition. But with the 11AZ design, we've got LTF repetitions there. And basically, you can improve the signal to noise ratio and therefore the range, because each of those LTFs is basically sounding the channel. You can superimpose those LTFs onto top of each other, which basically means the random noise, which is causing you problem in trying to determine the real signal, over a number of packets will cancel each other out to some extent, whereas the signal will be correlated and will boost. So that allows you to have a greater signal to noise ratio as a result of the repetitions. So that's the first big advantage. The next big one is about the spatial diversity that we get between the AP and the station, the mobile device. So if you like, in the classic sort of primitive radio technology, we had SISO, so single antennas on both sides. And you can see from the diagram on the left, if something blocks that, then the only thing, or blocks the direct path, then the only thing left is the non-line of sight path, which makes it very difficult for the client to actually figure out what's really happening, and would probably report the non-line of sight path, which is much longer in the estimation of the distance. If you have multiple paths, as shown on the right side, you can see that there's a chance that some of those paths perhaps have a direct line of sight, or at least a number of them are more effectively going directly to between the client and the access point. So this allows us to build accuracy. So with the comparing on the left-hand side, you see the 11MC scenario. In fact, 11MC did allow you to have one transmitter and two or more receivers, which you could then combine to create an improved estimation of the time. But it was only kind of a poor man's MIMO. With 11AZ, we have full MIMO. So we have all of the paths. So if you typically have an enterprise quality access point on the left-hand side with 4 antennas and a smartphone, which typically has 2 antennas, you can get 4x2, which is 8 paths out of that system. And obviously that's a tremendous improvement for the algorithm to have all the data in order to combine it in different ways and look at the most likely first path in that impulse response, which we showed a couple of slides back. To demonstrate the improvement in accuracy, consider here the chart shows the ranging error on the horizontal axis and the CDF, the error CDF on the vertical axis. And we have 20, 40, and 80 megahertz, 80 being the best in the black. And the charts are summarized with the RMS error. So you can see here that the 20 megahertz has 1.14 meters, and the 80 megahertz is 0.29 error there. So at each level there, we're getting a significant improvement across the bandwidth, thanks to if you're thinking about it in terms of the impulse response, those impulse responses are much sharper in the 80 with the 80 megahertz bandwidth. So then we'll look at the spatial diversity, and if we look at the chart here, we have a diversity from 1, so in other words, a 1-by-1 arrangement, up to a diversity of 8 paths, which is a 2-by-4 arrangement. And you can see again the charts are showing you are pushing into the top left-hand side of the CDF, improving the accuracy and the RMS error for the 8 paths is 0.26 meters, whereas for the single path in this particular case, it's 0.78 meters. So a significant improvement, and you can see that there's diminishing returns as you are increasing the number of paths. But clearly, you'd want to have those 8 paths rather than the single path, because in terms of practicality, 1/4 of a meter is certainly a lot better than 3/4 of a meter of error. So significant improvement with spatial diversity. Okay, so now switching to security. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of attacks that we have in a wireless key system. So here we're looking at just a snapshot of 2 robbers that are trying to steal a car. And they're using a very sophisticated technique in that they actually have something called a couple of boxes which allow them to perform a relay attack. So what happens is that one of the attackers stands by the car or leaves a box by the car, and this is close to the lock side. And then the attacker then moves around the house of the owner. So you can see here the car is parked in the drive. And what they're looking for is are looking to get close to the car keys, which perhaps are in a bowl in the kitchen or in the hall, as typically we might leave. And basically they're making the keys appear to be close to the car, because every radio signal which one is transmitting, it's repeated to the other one. And so you're now, if you like, shortcutting the range between the two. So and now effectively the car will open under these circumstances. The way to defeat this kind of attack, the relay attack, is to include the range estimate in the lock opening algorithm, so that they check that the range is within a meter. And of course, the relay attack doesn't defeat the speed of light. You still have to travel over the RF between the 2 relay boxes. And so in this way, by using location, we can solve the problem. But unfortunately, there are still other attacks which the attacker can have. And so, the adversary can certainly do a number of things. So one of the things is that they can simply replace the time. They can attack the contents of the frames. They can attack the timestamps, which are included, for instance, in the LMR that Jonathan talked about. We can solve this relatively easily by having encryption at both ends. So in other words, you can't replace the timestamps very easily because you'd have to know the encryption key. But a more interesting attack is the phi-level security attack, where they can actually attack the waveforms themselves and impersonate and falsify those waveforms to their advantage to make 2 devices look closer than they really are. And this seems like an impossible thing, but you have to think back to what I talked about with the impulse response. And the impulse response is derived from combining all those subcarriers. And if you can attack the phases of those subcarriers, you can change the phases of those subcarriers, then you can change where that impulse response occurs, and change effectively what people calculate as the time of, or the receiver calculates as the time of arrival. So here we're showing 11MC, where we can listen, find the start of the packet, do some processing, and then basically create some overlays onto the LTF, which contains the new phases that we need to provide in order to change the time. But this particular attack in this form relies on the attacker knowing the relative phases of all those subcarriers in that packet. And for 11MC, that was known. That was just that's just a standard LTF there. And so it's very easy for the attacker to figure out what phases he has to overlay to create that issue. And what we've done with 11az is that we've scrambled the LTF so that we have a set of pseudo random phases and amplitudes of those subcarriers. And so we call this a secure HE-LTF symbol. And of course, you still need to, at the receiver, you still need to know what those phases are. But what we do is we have a pseudo-random encryption of this so that both ends know how to unscramble the LTFs. But now the attacker that we assume does not know the key for this and how to unscramble them basically has to process that packet. They can listen to the beginning of the LTF symbol. They can process like crazy, and then if they manage to figure it out, they'll have some time at the end, but it will be a relatively small part of the packet if they have time at all to replay it. And that's what we're relying on. Obviously, as time goes on and processing increase, it might be possible for somebody to attack it in the future, but then at that point, we'll move on to new versions of the protocol. But the initial estimates and the work which was done by members of the IEEE has assured us that it will be very difficult to attack this now, if not impossible, for many, many years into the future. So we feel good about the security situation with 11az. Oops, I'm sorry, wrong way. Okay, so now I'd just like to briefly talk about a future capability. This is actually part of the IEEE standard. To my knowledge, it hasn't been put into any product at this point, but I suspect it might be within a year or two. And this is the notion that you can increase the scale of which you can find the position of smartphones in an environment. If you think about the techniques that Jonathan has talked about so far, it requires both ends transmitting and receiving packets, which obviously increases the utilization of the channel. And if you have hundreds of people, perhaps in a stadium, then that's going to, at some point, overwhelm the bandwidth potential of the channel. And of course, you have data in the channel as well. So at some point, it becomes advantageous to have a listen-only system. And listen-only systems have been built. Obviously, GPS is a listen-only system, but LORAN was a seafaring system before GPS was common, and it used this concept of time difference of arrival with synchronized beacons, which would be lighthouses or something else on the coast. And the principle is that those lighthouses are synchronized, and you can, once you have synchronized beacons and somebody receives them, you can then plot lines of equal time difference, which turn out through the mathematics to be hyperbole. And if we do that between multiple pairs of stations, we end up with the intersection of multiple hyperbole, as you can see on the right-hand side in a MATLAB simulation of what it looks like. And that will be the position. The cool thing about this is it's listen only. Now, how can we apply that to everything that you've heard so far in the design that Jonathan talked about, particularly the TB design? Well, what we can do is we can have access points range periodically to each other. So in TB, we actually can take advantage of the parallelism and have, as you see on the picture on the left-hand side, the center AP is acting as an access point, and the APs on the side are acting as stations, and they're using the time sequence you can see on the right-hand side, where each one is ranging to the other using the classic T4 minus T1, T minus T3 minus T2 scheme to determine the time of flight. Now, to create TDOA positioning for a passive phone on the right-hand side, what we need to do is figure out if any of that information can be considered as two synchronized beacons. So we have two transmissions here, one at T1 from the black AP on the right-hand side there, and one at T3 from the bluey colored AP. And the problem is they're not synchronized, but there's enough information in that diagram to figure out how to correct for that time difference and as if they were synchronized. So it turns out what we need to do in order to do that is we need to subtract from the time which those two beacons arrive, the total time, T4 minus T1, minus the time of flight, which as these APs are bolted to the ceiling, they're in a fixed position. We know their separation already, and therefore we can calculate the time of flight. And therefore we need to subtract that dotted purple line on the diagram to correct for the two beacons. So once we've subtracted that correction, we now have the time difference of arrival, and then we can find our position in the same way as I described earlier with the Loran system. So that's for the future, and we look forward to that. So I'd like to now pass back to Jonathan, who will summarize.
We're at the almost the top of the hour, or just a bit over. So it's a good time to see what we went through. We saw that Wi-Fi ranging is in its third generation. It's 802.11az based, and that's the third generation for Wi-Fi positioning. 11az takes the technology or is based on Wi-Fi 6. We also saw that 11bk is appropriately based on 802.11be, which is in the commercial field is Wi-Fi 7. The approach Wi-Fi took was to create an added service and take advantage of the Wi-Fi ecosystem, and that will assure it a superior link budget, availability of spectrum, compatibility and coexistence with the main connectivity service, scalability, like Roy just mentioned, with regards to passive location, the use of trigger-based, before that, the use of non-trigger-based. All of those are stages in making .11 positioning more and more scalable. Adaptive to traffic, to varying traffic condition. We saw that in non-trigger based. The station, the individual station, the client can do measurements based off its current conditions. So if it's not moving, it can do more sporadic measurements versus a more rapid measurements if there's movement. Trigger-based, change that into using a pull, and the stations that are registered or subscribed to the service respond to the pull based on how much information they need or how refresh they need the measurement to be. And we saw passive location. And passive location was a receive-only technology, and that capped the overhead at a fixed cap. So there's that advantage. We saw the improvement in robustness, the introduction of MIMO, the introduction of larger and larger bandwidths, and secure operation, both at the MAC level to the PHY level. So what started off as a completely unencrypted technology became both encrypted at the MAC level, and there is pseudo-random sequences at the PHY level, so that will accompany us for the next years. So we have a secure technology. It's as mentioned, it's already 11bk already or just published, and we expect products that are in the field that are based on 11bk very soon. I think at this point, over to Edward for some questions from the audience.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Jonathan and Roy, for your great summary of the latest standard development related to Wi-Fi positioning. It's a very informative presentation with lots of useful information. So let us have a Q&A to answer a couple of questions before we conclude. For anyone, you could go to the Q&A section to type any questions. And actually, the first two questions, I believe it is to Jonathan, because these two questions, the participants type when Jonathan, you present your first section. So the first question is, for the TOF, time of flight, can it be done between stations only, or can it be done between station and AP?
Right. So if you read .11, the standard itself focuses on I station and R station. So it needs to be between two stations. The most basic passive location, as mentioned, is kind of a different flavor when we have two stations and the third station, which is the locating station. But let's take the first option, which is the non-trigger based and the trigger based. We have range measurements that are happening between an I station and R station. The R station many times is an access point, so it also can facilitate protocol like the LCI, which is reporting of its own known location. And so the R station can be an AP. It doesn't have to be an AP. Already in development is implementations that are working to introduce to the market 2 stations that are to do just proximity. So your smartphone and maybe your wearable, your laptop and your wearable, and so on, open the key knob to the entrance of your house. So yes, the R station, it's not a requirement for the R station to be an AP, but in the standard itself, it's described that the R station or facility for the R station to also be acting as an AP.
Great. And the second question actually is about clock sync. I mean the clock synchronization. I come and say that, interestingly, based on your presentation, low clock synchronization is needed for the time of flight calculation. So the question is, will it be beneficial to use it together with 802.11az? That standard is about the transport and impact of synchronization in time-sensitive network. And could it be used as defined now, or some improvements are needed? What's your personal opinion, Jonathan?
Well, actually, FTM doesn't need synchronization, right? It can create synchronization, and indeed 802.11az can use FTM as basis for synchronization of the complete system, and it is used, and it can be used in a wireless system that way. There are already implementations that actually do that for time-sensitive networks. We didn't mention it. We're focusing on positioning, but it is completely, that comment is completely correct. 1AS can and is using FTM for time-sensitive networks.
Okay. The next question maybe actually for both, because while you are working in Google, you are more on the OS implementation. I mean the operation system implementation of the location technology. And Jonathan, you are from Intel, from the chipset point of view. So our audience asks how this standard will implement. So it may be a very loose and generic question, but why? So from the OS point of view, is there anything that actually is quite different from the other when you need to incorporate the location and proximity technology into the OS? I mean, into the Google OS?
Yeah, so we've actually had an API for 11MC for some time. So we I think since 2018 we had the first API release, and we basically provide an interface which allows us to get the ranges from the phone to the access points, and then that's delivered up to the application level or even to the OS level, depending on what level you want to work with it. But from the application's point of view, it gets all the ranges, and then you can implement a multilateration algorithm to get a position. You'll be pleased to know, for those that work with Android, the Android operating system, that the 11AZ API looks identical to the 11MC API. So when you get those ranges back, it's the same ranging requests that you make to make that happen. You might say, well, how is that possible? Well, that's because we do a lot of it under the hood. So in order to range to something, you need to know the access, as an example, the access point that you're ranging to. So you would do a Wi-Fi scan, and you'd get back an object which actually contains all the information. So, for instance, it will tell you whether that particular access point is 11AZ capable. So that information is encoded in beacons, and then when we actually do the calculation, then we're using all the 11AZ interfaces to make that happen. So fundamentally, we've got a ranging system which will work across generations of the protocols that they're seeing.
Okay, great. So Jonathan, so for this generic question, maybe I can try to elaborate a little bit from the chipset point of view. So, because from the chipset point of view, Wi-Fi, people may always think that it is just for connectivity. And then now the location more or less can be considered as the added service. So how does the location actually affect the main data connectivity service, or actually everything is fine, that it does not affect at all?
Right. So yeah, that's an important point. You have the main connectivity service. It's possible that you're associated and have a high bandwidth connection to an access point. And now you would also like to do indoor navigation or doing proximity measurement as an additional service. So what's the interaction between the two? And there are several considerations, but we can see that in the field, we can see devices and they're designed from the get-go at the baseband level, because it's just the .11 or the Wi-Fi ecosystem, so that the main service is has the least amount of impact due to the introduction of an additional location service. In our case, the main question is the device you range with, whether it's an access point or another device, is it on the same channel or not? If it's on the same channel, the implications are negligible. If it's a different channel, you might you really don't see it. You might be able to see it in benchmarking, because you're seeing exact percentile out of some made up scenario of maximum bandwidth. But in general, in terms of user experience, the two services can coexist, because from the get-go they were designed that way.
Okay, great. Then let us talk about something about use case, because Roy also talked about use case, and there's one question saying that one of the last question actually, can this development, I mean the Wi-Fi positioning and proximity, improve the GIS, the Geographic Information System, and NIS, Network Information System, data used in the large facilities, for example, those in hydroelectric power station or in power grids? So more or less, will this Wi-Fi location service actually improve those data used in the large facilities?
Edward, I'm not too familiar with how that's used in these larger facilities. Is there more information in the question?
So maybe more or less like why I'm not sure if you aware of those geographic informations and network information system data. So the more or less the question is, will the Wi-Fi locationing help improve the accuracy or the precision of this kind of data?
Well, as I'm not so familiar with this, the only thing I can say is that with 11az we get sub-meter accuracy, and you saw from the accuracy charts. So if you need to have sub-meter accuracy, say of the order of quarter of a meter, half of a meter, then 11az is going to give you that. And if that's a benefit to these systems, then yes, almost certainly it would be.
Okay, great. And also because with the use of the large wavelength, it's also help a lot, right, from the 11BK perspective, that you have 320 megahertz bandwidth, right?
Yes. With the new 11BK amendment, yes, we expect to get even better, perhaps approaching the accuracy that some people advocate for things like UWB at 10 centimeters maybe.
And Jonathan, sorry for interrupt you, please.
The thing I'd like to mention, and Roy and myself were part of it, we're trying to see if we can expand the use of the .11 positioning service to emergency services like E911 in cellular networks. So whereas if you're connected to a cellular network and there is an E911 service, we're trying to see if we can use that on that scale to improve the accuracy, because many times GPS is not available when you're indoor, and the cellular network is unable to provide the same level of accuracy or even at the same scale that Wi-Fi positioning can. And that can bring you to provide much better emergency services. Roy, would you like to mention a bit about that?
Yes. So normally Android provides something called ELS, which is Emergency Location Services for cellular, and the cellular and the emergency service system can decide whether they want to use that or the cell tower estimation of where the phone is. And obviously, the phone usually has a much better idea because it has access to Wi-Fi and also GPS when outside as well. So that's extremely beneficial. The thing that we've done recently is that we've integrated RTT, or Wi-Fi RTT, Wi-Fi time of flight ranging into the core location API, which is the thing which feeds into the location system and provides that information for security services. So in other words, we call this the fused location provider. So it fuses all the technology. If it turns out that Wi-Fi RTT is present in the environment, then it will use that to calculate the position, and that will be the thing that's fed to the emergency services. So providing a much more accurate set of results for the emergency services. And the FCC tell us that if you can improve emergency service response by 1 minute, you will save 10,000 lives per year in the US. And that's because a lot of these things a lot of the responses are things like somebody's had a heart attack, there's a cardiac event, and just improving by 1 minute, you can sometimes save those people's lives.
Okay, great. And I believe it's already 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, and we need to conclude the webinar. And once again, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Jonathan and Roy for joining us today, and for many of you who also joined today, and to hear the latest ongoing standardization activities related to the next generation Wi-Fi positioning. As we mentioned at the very beginning in the video, if you are interested in participating in and contributing to our CS standard activities, you can visit computer.org to find our ongoing calls for participation and get involved. And I understand some of you may be very curious about whether you will see this slide again and record the webinars again. Definitely, the answer is yes. And actually, sooner or later this week, you will receive an email that about our next webinar about functional safety standards that we will organize on October 29th. And also during that email, you will also receive this slide deck and also the recording of this webinar. So thank you very much for all of you for coming. And thank you, our CS staff also, especially Scott, for hosting the call. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your day. This webinar is concluded. Thank you so much all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.